Thank you very much, Tara. So in terms of format, I'm going to provide a few brief remarks about the book, and then that will help to set up the conversation that I'd like to moderate with a terrific group of panelists that we have here today, who I will introduce to you in a moment's time. So if I were to have to put a title on my remarks, the title would be What Role for Arts Councils in the 21st Century? Not a small question. The context for Arts Council has changed fundamentally since the early years of their creation. There's been tremendous social and value change. There's been tremendous technological change and very substantial changes in views about the role of the state. All of these have transformed the arts ecosystem and the broader social, political, economic context within which arts councils exist. What's more, the pace of change seems ever on the rise. How are arts councils to keep up? How are they to remain relevant? What role for arts councils in the 21st century? So this is the part where I read from the book. I'm only going to read from the book once, I promise. And it's actually not going to be something that I wrote. So it's a brief quote. And I'd ask that you ask yourself two things as I read this quote. The first is, who said this? And the second is, when did they say it? Okay, I promise you there won't be a test afterwards. There are probably enough people in the room who will know the answer to this question. John Goldsmith, probably at the top of that list. So here we go. To meet the challenging needs and the opportunities of the country as we see them ahead, the Canada Council is there. It will be best judged by what it accomplishes. I believe that the best things it will do will be to assist people, individuals, to make a better use of their own capacities. Because the future of our country, in every field, but particularly in this, depends on people. The Canada Council, we hope, will be regarded as a people's organization to serve people and to enrich our national life. Inspiring stuff. What's fascinating to me about that quote is that it could have been written at any time in the Council's history and still be relevant. But the actual timing was 60 years ago, and those words were spoken, John Goldsmith, they were spoken by Brooke Claxton, inaugural chair of the Canada Council, to a speech at a joint event organized in Toronto by the Canada Club and the Empire Club. In fact, it was one of his inaugural speeches as chair of the Canada Council. Now, people in Ottawa will know Claxton predominantly for the Brooke Claxton building in Tunney's Pasture. But Claxton was a huge figure in the history of the Canada Council. He was one of the primary champions advocating for the creation of a federal arts council going back to the early post-war period. Indeed, he championed the creation of the Royal Commission on National Development in the Arts, Letters and Sciences, the Massey-Levesque Commission, which ultimately recommended creation of the Canada Council. And as a cabinet member in the Mackenzie King and Saint Laurent governments, he championed the government's creation of the council as well. So it was rather fitting that he was named chair. So why was he, and many others, why were they such ardent believers in the creation of a federal arts council? Well, at the time, Canada was something of an intellectual colony, as my good friend Chad Gatfield is wont to say of the scholarly context of that time in the country. Very limited scholarly architecture in terms of universities, in terms of PhD programs, in terms of Canadian studies didn't even exist as a field of inquiry at that time. Relatively limited artistic scene, certainly not an artistic scene that was receiving the support that it does today. And the Massey-Levesque Commission made this abundantly, if rather embarrassingly, clear in its final report. So those early years of the Canada Council in the late 1950s were a fundamentally different time than they were now. Confidence in government at that time, this is what really interests me in that period. There was a lot of confidence in government at that time. Government was viewed as a force for positive change, that it could manage issues effectively. Confidence that government could actually solve problems. and could create and manage the organizations that would enable it to do so. Fast forward 60 years, do we still have that same confidence in government? No, we don't. Last year's Edelman Trust Barometer, the global survey of public trust in institutions, stated the following: trust is in crisis around the world. The general population's trust in all four key institutions, business, government, NGOs, and the media, has declined broadly. Here in Canada, we fared a little less poorly than in other countries. But research that my institute has completed on the energy sector through our Positive Energy Project is sobering. Big shout out to the Positive Energy crowd in the back of the room today. When we asked Canadians how governments are doing when it comes to securing public confidence in energy decision making, what percent of Canadians do you think responded that governments are doing very good when it comes to public confidence in energy decision making? Oh, not bad, Sharon. Okay. So I don't need two hands to tell you the answer. I only need one hand, and I don't need my thumb. 2% of Canadians. Fully half of Canadians said governments are doing poorly or very poorly when it comes to building confidence in energy decision making. Now, lest you think that this is a general population phenomenon, we ask the same question of energy leaders, right? So this is people from government, from business, from NGOs, Indigenous communities, and the like. What do you think the elite crowd said about very good when it comes to public confidence? Yeah, cut that in half. 1% that they thought that Canada is doing very good when it comes to building public confidence in energy decision making. And 2/3, so we went from half to 2/3 thinking that Canada is doing poorly or very poorly. Sobering stuff. Decline in trust and confidence in government is part of a broader suite of social and value changes in the post-war period that I track in the book and that I think is really important for us to bear in mind when we think about the future of our institutions. So in conjunction with the decline of trust and confidence, we also have a decline of deference. Right? When we go to the doctor, we don't necessarily agree with what they say to us. We have done our own research. People also want to be involved in decisions that affect them. Right? The democratization of decision making. People don't just say, sure, governments, we trust you to make all the great decisions. They want to be involved in decisions that affect them. And we've also seen a shift from collective values to individual values, and line of sight very much being at the individual level. Now, lots of changes are not necessarily challenging in the way that some of the ones that I've just mentioned are. Some changes have been tremendously exciting. A growing recognition of Indigenous rights, reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, women's rights, growing multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity in our societies, multi-identity societies, increasing social diversity and social values. We're far less Western European in Canada, certainly, than we were in the 1950s. Now, there are many other major changes as well, but I want to point to two of them here, and I'm glad to see folks from the Institute here because they could speak to you about these changes for hours. Technological change. The accelerating pace of technological change, including a growing number of highly disruptive technologies, both for the good and for the ill. Whether it's artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, lethal autonomous weapons, gene editing, algorithms, I could go on, and many of my colleagues at the Institute could also go on. How on earth are governments supposed to keep up? How are arts councils supposed to keep up? How are arts organizations supposed to keep up? Social media and the internet, the rise of disintermediated communications, far fewer gatekeepers, right? Who do people trust? Do they go to the mainstream media, or do they go to their friends, celebrities, Facebook algorithms, online gurus? Second change I want to point to is political change. Fundamental transformation in views about the role of the state. From the confidence and expansion of state apparatuses in the 1950s and 1960s towards growing skepticism and government capacity and concerns about government capacity throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. The rise of neoconservatism and neoliberalism. So think Thatcher in the UK, Reagan in the US, Mulroney here in Canada. Much smaller state, deregulation, privatization, liberalization, fiscal conservative, on and on and on and on. So an intensification of short-term politics, right? The time horizon of policy and political decision-making becoming much, much quicker, much shorter. So overall, all of this to say, context is fundamentally different. And we've seen a decline of confidence in governments and in the capacities of government to effectively manage markets, social issues, and technologies. And some of the preparatory work for the panel today, that was a good deal of what we spoke about as a group. So how has the Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, navigated this changing context? Now, as Philip mentioned, the overarching thesis in the book is that the Council, in terms of its emphasis, it has quite a broad mandate, but in terms of the emphasis on that mandate, has really focused, there's been a shift over the last 60 years from what I refer to in the book as the roots of culture, so focusing in on the building of artistic supply and artistic infrastructure, to the power of art, so moving much more to thinking about engagement, public engagement with the arts, and the demand and engagement side of the arts. Now that made a lot of sense, actually, if you think about it from an organizational and context perspective. Given the relatively barren artistic and scholarly landscape of the 1950s, that the Council's early years should be focusing on again, what I call in the book, and there's Chad, hello Chad, on what I call the roots of culture and artistic supply. Over time, as supply proliferated, and we've seen a proliferation of artistic content in the country, that the Council has begun to expand its focus as well to include the power of art. So focusing in on questions of demand, of public engagement, and the like. And as it's done so, it has had to navigate and strike a balance between five, and I point these out in the book, I'm not going to go into them exhaustively here, but we can talk about them a little bit on the panel, 5 core tensions that are inherent in the Council's work and that have really followed it over the course of its 6-decade history. So the tension between, first, art for art's sake, right? So just supporting the arts in and of themselves, and the pursuing broader social and economic aims. And of course, the concern there is, if you move too far to one end of that spectrum, there's concerns about instrumentalization of the arts, and we see that in many instances and critiques that can be raised. Tension number 2, focusing on the needs of artists and arts organizations, and focusing on the needs of Canadian society writ large. And of course, those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but at the end of the day, I think the Council needs to ask itself, who's the client? Right? At the end of the day, who's the target of its interventions? Third, between support for traditional art forms, institutions, and practices, and emerging art forms, institutions, and practices. And that can refer to non-Western European art forms, emerging arts organizations with different sorts of governance models, large established organizations on the one hand, smaller emerging organizations on the other. Fourth tension, between organizational leadership and followership. The Council, one of the things that I was so tremendously fascinated by, Tara mentioned I'm curious, I think that's a very good adjective to describe me. One of the things I was really fascinated by was the extent to which the Council is so fundamentally rooted in the arts ecosystem. And that enables the Council to actually follow where the arts is going, but at the same time, the Council needs to also exercise a leadership role. It is the only pan-Canadian arts funding body in the country. And then finally, the tension between organizational autonomy and collaboration with the government of the day. The Council is an arm's length institution. It was set up as an arm's length institution for all the reasons that many folks in this room would know in terms of avoiding political interference in arts grants making. But at the same time, it is still a government body funded by taxpayers' dollars. So trying to strike those balance points and working through where the tensions are between autonomy as an organization, but also collaboration with the government of the day. And there's been a lot of shifts and twists and turns in that over the Council's history. So what is the future going to look like? We're going to tease on some of these tensions over the course of the next little bit here. And that's where we turn to now. It is my tremendous pleasure to have what an outstanding panel of people to help us with us today. Now you've got the bios on your chair, so I'm not going to read. You could probably be here for the rest of the afternoon and the evening if I were to read off the bios of such an august panel. Collectively, this group has multiple decades, I won't say how many, I'm going to name some of them, multiple years of experience to their credit. I'm privileged to have all of them with us here today. I'm also very grateful and honored that the person who doesn't look like Jocelyn Harvey is actually Frédéric Julien, who agreed at a very late date to step in. Unfortunately, Jocelyn Harvey, due to illness, can't join us today. So we have from your left to right, Carolyn Andrew, who's the Director of the Centre on Governance here at the University of Ottawa, Frédéric Julien, as I mentioned, from Capicoa. We have Stephen Blank, who is visiting us here from New York as a senior fellow with the University of Ottawa, and John Hobday, who many in the room will know is former Director of the Canada Council. So at this point, this is where I get to grill these folks and have a really interesting discussion with them. One of the things that I'll just kind of heads up now, in the preparatory meetings for this, I couldn't get a word in edgewise, and I don't think any of them could get a word in edgewise either, so get ready for hopefully something pretty lively. So please join me in welcoming our panel, and we're looking forward to the conversation.